Hi everyone, and welcome to this European Respiratory Society webinar on physical activity, entitled Physical Activity as an Outcome Measure or as a way to provide feedback to patients. How should it be assessed, analyzed, and interpreted? My name is André Nyberg. I'm an associate professor at Umeå University in Sweden, and I will be the chair and moderator of this webinar. And before introducing our speaker, I will briefly highlight the aims and goals of this webinar and some practicalities. First of all, the educational aim of this webinar is to shed light on the objective physical activity assessment in patients with respiratory diseases, and more specifically focusing on which devices that can be used, which physical activity variables that can be looked at, and how physical activity data should be handled and interpreted. This is both when one aims to use physical activity as an outcome measure, as well as with the aim to providing feedback to patients. The webinar comprises of a 40-minute lecture by Helene that will be followed by a 16-minute Q&A session. And during the webinar, you will be asked to share your opinion on issues that are related to this topic using interactive polls. And in addition to this, if you have any questions to Helene, you can use the chat function to post your questions. And this can be done throughout the presentation, but they will be answered after Helene has finished her talk. And you can also use the raise hand function in Zoom if you, again, would like to ask Helene a question, but this will then be answered after the presentation. So the speaker of this webinar is Dr. Helene de Meyer from Leuven in Belgium. Helene is an assistant professor in physiotherapy, and Helene really lives, sleeps, and breathes physical activity. So we are very happy to have Helene here with us today and to guide us on this highly relevant topic. Welcome, Helene.
Thank you, Andre. Many thanks for this great introduction. I would like to start with thanking the physiotherapy group for inviting me to give this lecture today. It's really an honor to be the presenter in this very first physiotherapy ERS webinar. So it's with great pleasure that I'm giving this talk this evening. So as Andre said, this evening we will talk about physical activity, and I will mainly focus on the objective measurement of physical activity. I am trying to go to the next slide. I don't know why it's not working. Okay. Perfect. So I will start with providing a very short introduction on why we should measure physical activity, or why you should think about measuring physical activity. Then the techniques to measure physical activity, so which monitor can you use? And then the final part will be on the data collection, post-processing, and interpretation of physical activity data. So first, why would you think about measuring physical activity? Just to start and to be sure that we are all on the same page, we are talking about physical activity today. So physical activity is all the activity that a person or a patient is doing during the entire day. So we are not talking about sport, but we are talking about all the activity that you can do. And it's really everything that a patient is doing throughout the day. And we know that patients with respiratory diseases, and I've plotted here, for example, patients with COPD going from GOLD stage 1 until GOLD stage 4, patients are more inactive as compared to healthy controls. And these bars show the percentage of patients or healthy controls that are defined as being severely inactive or inactive, and I've chosen here the cutoff of doing less than 7,500 steps per day. So you definitely see that patients with COPD are less active as compared to healthy controls. This is not only the case for patients with COPD, but also patients with ILD and patients 1 year after receiving a lung transplantation. There you see that more than 85% of patients can be defined as being too inactive. And so this is physical activity, and we're not talking about exercise capacity or what a patient can do. So the x-axis here on this graph is what a patient can maximally do. So your exercise capacity here measured by a 6-minute walk test. And the y-axis is what a patient is actually doing, patient or a person, because here in green, I have plotted some healthy controls that we have measured in our research group at KU Leuven. And if I display here the step-defined cutoffs by Tudor-Lock on this graph, you see that patients or healthy subjects here have a rather good exercise capacity. And in these subjects, you can see that there are people that are active here, those at the top of the graph, but there are also people that chose to be inactive. So for a certain exercise capacity, you actually have the active choice of being active or being inactive. And if we add the patients with COPD on this graph, you see the same for people or patients that have a good exercise capacity, but for patients with a poor exercise capacity, you see that there is still a range in their physical activity, but that this range is smaller. And the same applies for patients with ILD and also our patients after a lung transplantation. We know that physical activity is an important outcome. It's related to morbidity, but also mortality. And therefore, more and more physical activity is now included in research as a primary or a secondary outcome, but also more and more in clinical routine. And also the measurement of physical activity is part of the interventions that we do to promote physical activity. And this is why there are several reasons why you could think about measuring physical activity in your patients. And with this, I would like to start with the first question for you. What is for you the reason to measure physical activity in your practice? Is this typically to characterize the physical activity of an individual patient, provide feedback to an individual patient, characterize a group of patients, or do you aim to test the effectiveness of an intervention? And there are multiple answers that can be given, and we would like to have an idea about why you are today measuring physical activity. And if your answer is other, you can maybe specify this other in the chat. Okay, great. So I think most of you are now focusing on measuring the physical activity in an individual patient. So both to give a characterization or to give direct feedback. And 1 out of 2 is also testing the effectiveness of an intervention. Okay, so we have a lot of reasons to measure physical activity, and these reasons will also dictate which outcome or which activity monitor you will use. So therefore, I will specify with each activity monitor what the aim of your measurement can be. So the reasons to measure physical activity, we can actually make 2 groups. And the first group is when you would like to characterize the physical activity of an individual patient or when you want to provide direct feedback to that individual patient. And this will be completely different as if your aim is to give a characterization or do analysis on a whole group of patients. And why is it, I think, very interesting to measure physical activity in an individual patient is because it provides us a lot of information about the physical activity pattern. And I've plotted here the physical activity pattern of 2 patients with COPD who were followed in our research team for a couple of months. And you see that both our patients with COPD, they actually have a quite comparable lung function, FEV1 of 53% in the left patient, and this right patient only has an FEV1 of 46%. But you immediately see that the physical activity pattern of those 2 patients are completely different. This left patient has a quite broad range in his physical activity. He has days with 7,500 steps, but he also has days with only 2,500 steps, so very low active days. And this physical activity on these low active days are comparable to this right patient who shows not a lot of variability in her physical activity. And I think following a patient for a couple of weeks can provide you a lot of information to also, or as a basis to act on that physical activity pattern. In the left patient, I think if you need to guess on which days we are providing pulmonary rehabilitation in KU Leuven, then it would not be hard for you to guess that these rehabilitation sessions are provided on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, because these 3 days are always the most active days in our patient. But then you see that on non-training days, the patient really doesn't do anything of physical activity anymore. So if you can show this physical activity pattern to your patient, this can be a very good basis to talk to your patient and to motivate him to also do some activity on these non-active days. But also the opposite, if you see a very active day, you can ask the patient, what did you do on this Saturday? Can you try to put some or include some more Saturdays to your daily life? So this measurement of physical activity really provides us with a lot of information. So it's, I think, very interesting to measure the physical activity of a patient for a longer time to have some insight in the pattern. And then the second group of reasons to measure physical activity is more the characterization of a complete group of patients or test the effectiveness of an intervention. So this is more if your physical activity measurement is included in a research project or study. So how should we measure physical activity? You can actually make two broad groups. The first is the self-report, and the second group is the activity monitoring. But I already said that for today, we will only focus on the activity monitoring. We know that the self-report, by using questionnaires, can be used to screen severe inactive patients to give you a very first broad screening, but it will never give you a very accurate measurement of the physical activity of an individual patient. It can also be used to classify groups of patients. For example, if you would like to do large studies on thousands of patients, it might be interesting just to give a classification of your patient, but it will never provide you with an individual physical activity assessment or measure in an individual patient. So therefore, we will focus on activity monitoring. In the activity monitoring, there are several classes, let's say, and I've made 3 groups, and we will start with the medical devices. And these medical devices are accelerometers, more complex accelerometers, that have a lot of advantages. So the first advantage is that it provides us with a lot of information, very detailed information. You have information of or on a daily basis about the physical activity of your patient, but also hour by hour, minute by minute, and even more detailed if you would like to. There are several monitors that have been validated specifically in patients with chronic respiratory diseases. And I've included here 2 references, which are 2 large validation studies provided by the ProActive project. And this project concluded that the Actigraph, the Senseware, and the Dynaport Move monitor are valid accelerometers or activity monitors to measure physical activity in our patients with chronic respiratory diseases. An advantage is that the devices provide information on wearing time of the device. And this is crucial in the quality control of your data. And this will come later in the rest of my presentation, but wearing time is really crucial. If you see a low number of physical activity in your patient, you would like to be 100% sure that this is because the patient was not active and not because the patient was not wearing his monitor or there was a technical issue with the monitor. So wearing time is really very crucial, and these devices all provide you with information on this wearing time. Important to note is that whereas these 3 devices that I just mentioned are the 3 of them valid or validated to measure physical activity, they will not provide you with exact the same information. So never use these 3 devices within the same project or within the same patient, because it will not provide you then the information you would like to. And this is an analysis we have done in patients where we measured physical activity with these 3 devices. And you see on the graph, which is expressing the mean steps per day, that the actigraph significantly provides us with a lower step count as compared with the Dynaport and the SenseWear armband. So never use these devices or never interchange these devices, but always use the same device within the same project and within the same patient if you would like to say something about the evolution of the physical activity of your patient. Beside these 3 devices, there are some other devices that have been validated in patients with COPD, but these validation studies are maybe a less known and less broad, let's say, but there are some other devices that have been validated and you can find in literature. The disadvantages of using these medical devices is that they are more expensive as the other monitors that I will explain later. They mostly have a short battery life, typically 2 to 3 weeks, and you can assess physical activity for 2 to 3 weeks. And the final disadvantage is that they don't provide you with feedback. But this sometimes is not not a disadvantage, but rather an advantage. For example, if you would like to have a blind or your patient still blinded for the physical activity, if you include physical activity as an endpoint in your project, then sometimes it's better to not provide feedback about the physical activity, for example, at the start of your project. So sometimes this disadvantage is not really a disadvantage. So as a recommendation, these medical devices provide us with an accurate measurement of an individual patient's physical activity, and they are typically very good in changing or to test the change in physical activity over time. So if you would like to include physical activity as an outcome in your projects, in your studies, then it's recommended to choose to use a medical device or an accelerometer that has been validated to measure physical activity in the assessment. Then we go to the next category, which are the step counters and the activity trackers. And I've also included smartphone devices because more and more we see also research that use smartphone devices to measure physical activity in our patients. And actually, you can bundle these into wearables. And we all know that more and more patients and also, I think, healthy subjects are owning their own wearable devices. But there are a lot of different wearables on the market today. And if you go from left to right on this line, then you have the less complex devices to the more complex devices. And the more to the right, the more sensors they also have included in the wearables. Nowadays, you also have wearables that provide you with information on respiratory rate, oxygen saturation. So actually, this is a field that is moving very fast, and every day there are new wearables on the market with more and more sensors that provide us with information about our patients. But let's start with the less complex devices, which are the step counters. Step counters are very cheap devices. They are ready and easy to use. Mostly they have a long battery life. So as compared to the medical devices where we only had 2 or 3 weeks of battery life, most step counters have a long battery life or can be easily charged by the patient himself. They provide direct feedbacks, and most step counters also have an internal memory. As a disadvantage, they only provide us with information of the step count of the patient. So if you would like to have information on time in at least moderate intense physical activity, for example, which is also known to be an important outcome measure, then step counters will not provide you with this information. But I think for us, working with patients with respiratory disorders, the most important disadvantage is the accuracy, especially because step counters are less accurate in slowly walking populations. And I think we all know that our patients are slowly walking patients, or they walk slower as compared to healthy controls. So this is really a disadvantage. And I've summarized here 3 studies who made the comparison of accuracy depending on the walking speed of a subject. And you see here on the y-axis the percentage compared to the visual step count, which is the golden standard. So if this would be 100%, then the visual step count is exactly the same as the measurement with the step counter. And you see here as well in this study performed in Brazil, as these 2 other studies, that if patients walk slower, that the accuracy drops. So if you have a patient that is slowly walking, there will always be an underestimation of the number of steps that a patient is taking. So especially if you use these measurements to provide information to your patient, please bear in mind that it might be that these step counters are providing you with an underestimation of these steps. And another important disadvantage is that they don't provide us with information on wearing time. And as I already mentioned, wearing time is really a crucial element in the quality control of your physical activity assessment. Then we go to the next group, which are the activity trackers, which are accelerometers or accelerometers that are embedded in a wearable. And most of the advantages are exactly the same as compared to the step counters. And they have additional advantages that, for example, they have Bluetooth connection, so which means that your patient can transfer the data, his or her data, to you by Bluetooth through a smartphone application or through a web-based platform. So you can actually easily provide the patient with feedback from a distance. So these activity trackers are especially very interesting to use as part of a remote physical activity coaching program, for example. Another advantage is that you can choose the wearable based on the preference of the patient, because you have activity trackers that can be worn at the wrist, but also at the waist. But also the disadvantages are comparable to those of the step counters, and the most important disadvantage on accuracy actually remains when using an activity tracker. And this is work from Astrid Blondeel, and these left 3 graphs are data measured in patients with COPD. You see in orange the measurement by the Dynaport Move Monitor, which is the medical device, then the a wearable worn at the wrist and a wearable waist, and in black, a wearable worn at the wrist. You see that the wearable worn at the waist provides also or results in an underestimation of more than 1,000 steps per day as compared to the Dynaport Move Monitor. So this disadvantage remains the same. These other 3 graphs are the same measurement, but in healthy controls. And here you see that, and actually this is also in line with the data that we have with the step counters, is that the wearable on the waist is actually quite good. It's not underestimating anymore, but here we see that the wearable on the wrist is providing us with an overestimation of almost 2,000 steps per day. So the accuracy remains actually an issue when using activity trackers. But what is good news is that if you plot, instead of the mean physical activity at the group level of the entire week, but if you plot the physical activity pattern, and again, this pattern is really interesting if you would like to provide information and feedback to your patient. This physical activity pattern is actually captured in the same way by the 3 devices. And here you see 2 graphs representing 2 random patients, or the physical activity pattern of 2 random patients. And you see that the physical activity on less active days, or the drop in physical activity, is captured by the 3 devices. So again, this is the medical device, the Dynaport Move Monitor, the wearable worn at the waist and the wearable worn at the wrist. And you see that the pattern in physical activity is actually captured by the three devices in a rather similar way. So whereas there is a disadvantage that the accuracy of these activity trackers is probably not enough to measure physical activity in a valid way in our patients, they can be used as a coaching tool. And this is, I think, really important remark, and also important for those that would like to use these activity trackers as part of a physical activity intervention. The disadvantage remains the same as compared to the step counters for most of these devices, and the fact that they are not providing us information with wearing time is still the case. And then finally, I would like to discuss with you the use of smartphones to measure physical activity, but I first would like to have your opinion. So what do you think? Smartphone-based measures, can they be used to characterize an individual patient, to provide feedback to the individual patient? Can they be used to characterize a group of patients, to show the effectiveness of an intervention? Or the fifth option is, I don't trust them. They cannot be used to measure physical activity at all. I'm really curious to see whether there are believers or non-believers about smartphone-based measures. Okay, so the majority of you actually say that it can be used to provide feedback to an individual patient. And then some of you also would like to use them to characterize the physical activity of an individual patient. Okay, I don't think I can give you a clear answer on this question today because there is not a lot of research done in patients with respiratory diseases. But let me first start with the advantages. Well, most patients or a lot of patients nowadays have a smartphone device, so we don't need an additional device to measure physical activity. It's ready and easy to use. A smartphone provides direct feedback to a patient, and most smartphones also have an internal memory when you use the health app. But I think the most important disadvantage is that today we don't have a lot of information about the accuracy of using smartphone devices to measure physical activity. And I couldn't find any research actually patients with COPD or other respiratory disorders, but I found this study in patients with cancer with comparable age. So I think this provides us with a first insight. And these researchers asked these patients with cancer to wear the Actigraph. So again, this is a valid medical device, and they compared it with a measurement with the smartphone device of the patient. And you see that at the group level, there is no difference between the physical activity measured with the Actigraph as compared to the smartphone. And you also have a very high ICC. But as a remark, and I think a very important remark, is the fact that these patients were asked to wear the smartphone device on a belt, so a fixed belt provided by the researchers to make sure that the smartphone was on the same location as the Actigraph. And patients were also asked to precisely wear the smartphone device together with the Actigraph from the moment they woke up until the moment they went to bed. So we don't know that when this measurement is not standardized, whether it will provide you with the same information. And this is really important because I found this recent study where researchers investigated the accuracy of using a smartphone device to measure physical activity. And this is data in the healthy population, so we cannot completely interpret these data as being the same in our patients, but I thought it provides a lot of interesting information. And you see that first of all, wearing time, because this is really important, that patients or healthy subjects in this case who report that they are not carrying their iPhone with them have a very large underestimation, and this is in green. So they have an underestimation of their real step count measured here with a pedometer. So if patients are not wearing their smartphone, you will not have a measurement of physical activity. Well, I think this is what we all could expect, but we are not sure whether patients are constantly wearing their smartphone device. Another important aspect is, I think, the placement of your smartphone device. And this is the same study, so again, in healthy participants, and they compared the accuracy of the smartphone measurement in patients or subjects who reported that they wore the iPhone in their pockets, in red here, as compared to people who reported that they were wearing their smartphone in their bag. And here also you see that if people are reporting they are wearing their smartphone in their bag, you have a huge underestimation as compared to the pedometer measurement of physical activity. So placement and wearing time is, I think, very crucial. And if we then look to patients with COPD, and this is a small survey we did in our university hospital, and we asked patients if they owned a smartphone device. We asked them about the placement of their smartphone, and we asked this separately when they are inside the house and outside the house. And you see that especially if patients are inside the house, that patients are not wearing their smartphone with them. So you miss actually a very important part of the day, I think, in your physical activity measurement. And also if patients are outside the house, 1 out of 2 patients answered that they are wearing this in their purse or their backpack. So in patients with COPD, I really think, but this is my opinion because there is no data, but I really think that today we cannot trust the measurement of physical activity when using a smartphone device. Another disadvantage of the smartphone is also that we don't have data on wearing time and we don't have a standardized placement next to the accuracy. So to summarize, which device should you choose? It depends on the aim of your assessment. So if you aim for a measurement of an individual patient, then you can use a step counter or an activity tracker, knowing that the disadvantage is that it might provide you with an underestimation of the physical activity, but knowing that these devices, especially the activity trackers, are good enough or valid enough to be a coaching or to be used as a coaching tool. Smartphone devices, I doubt whether we can use these to measure physical activity in our patients. Second group, if you would like to characterize the as a group of patients, or especially when you aim to test an intervention effect, then I would always recommend to use medical devices or accelerometers. And then finally, so if you have chosen which device you want to use, then you have to think about how will you collect your data, how will you post-process your data, and also interpret your data. And this standardization of data collection, post-processing, and interpretation that I will present to you is the result of a task force or a working group that was initiated by the COPD Foundation, and I was very lucky that I could contribute to this task force. And we hope that the paper about these recommendations will be published very soon, and you will find these online. So let's start with the data collection. So the first part on the data collection or important choice you have to make is whether you want to have or whether you do a 24-hour measurement. So instruct the patient to always wear the activity monitor, or whether you instruct the patient to wear the activity monitor during waking hours. As a recommendation, if you are only interested in physical activity, then I think you can choose to only ask patients to wear the device during waking hours. But of course, if you're interested in sleep, then you have to ask the patient to wear the device for 24 hours. And if you have chosen for the 24-hour assessment, then we recommend to standardize your physical activity assessments at a group level between 7 a.m. in the morning and 10 p.m. in the evening. Of course, if you have the information of every individual patient when you woke up and when the patient went to sleep, this is even better. But if you don't have that information, the recommendation would be to standardize your physical activity assessment between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. And this graph shows the physical activity pattern of a group of patients in Leuven, so in Belgium. And we also, as part of the task force, we investigated whether this pattern would be different between different countries. And actually, in all countries across different centers that we have analyzed, we see that this pattern is valid, or this choice of standardization is valid, and you can use 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. Then how many days do we need to measure physical activity? I think it is obvious that we need several days of assessment to have and information about the physical activity pattern of our patients. And I've used here one of the figures out of one of the very first studies of Fabio Pitta on physical activity in patients with COPD. And you see that there is a lot of variation or day-by-day variation in the physical activity of our patients. So we will need a number of days before we can say something about the physical activity pattern of the patient. And the recommended number of days of measurement is 7 days. So it's recommended to measure for 1 week, or to measure physical activity for 1 week in your patient. And I will come back later on why this was decided to be 7 days. This is actually to be sure to have the minimal number of days in your assessment. Then this was about data collection. Then if your patient comes back after this 1 week of measurement, then you still need to do actually quite a lot of things in the post-processing of this physical activity data before you can really have, or before you really have a valid physical activity outcome. And the very first thing I would recommend to do is to check the wearing time on a day-by-day basis. And this is really crucial. I already mentioned it. It's really crucial to know whether this day of assessment is valid or whether this physical activity assessment day cannot be interpreted in a reliable way. And the recommended minimal number of wearing hours is now set at 8 hours during waking hours. So again, if you have chosen for the 24-hour assessment, we recommend to standardize the assessment between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. and then define your valid day as having at least 8 hours of wearing time before you can define this day as being a valid day. And you see that if you use 8 hours of wearing time, and this is an analysis we have done on a data set of patients starting a rehabilitation program at KU Leuven, and if you use at least 8 hours of wearing time for every day, then in most of patients you will end up with at least 5 days of assessment when you have done the measurement for 7 days in your patient. Then is it important to only include weekdays or weekend days in your assessment? Well, here, this is in this analysis, we have compared physical activity on weekdays, which are the solid graphs, compared to weekend days, which are the open graphs. And you see that actually, and this is the case in the UK, but also in Brazil and the other countries that I have plotted here, you see that weekend days on the group level are always less active as compared to weekdays. So it actually will change your physical activity assessment, whether you include weekdays or weekend days. So therefore, it's recommended, if you would like to characterize the physical activity of your sample, to also include the weekend days in your mean physical activity outcome. Then how many days should a measurement be to be included in your analysis? So what is the minimal requirement of number of days before you include this physical activity measurement in your analysis? And the first, or if we look to this in a cross-sectional data analysis, so if you only have one measurement in your patient, then the way to look at this is looking at the intra-class correlation coefficient to know whether your measurement is reliable, and we want to aim for an ICC, or intra-class correlation coefficient, above 0.8. And I've plotted here, if you include 2 days in your analysis, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days in your analysis, or 7 days, which is also including the weekend days, you see that actually 2 weekdays will already result in a reliable assessment, but the more days you include in your assessment, the higher your intra-class correlation coefficient. So therefore, it's recommended to aim for at least 4 days of 4 days of valid data in your assessment. But then another way to look at this is when using longitudinal analysis. And here on this left graph, you see the physical activity effects, so the change in steps or change in physical activity. And you see that there's actually no difference whether you include 2 days in your analysis, 3 days, 4 days, or at least 5 days, 7 days. But you do see that the effect size will increase when you include more days in your outcome measure, which means that we don't change the magnitude of the effect, but we do change the variability of the outcome measure. So therefore, it's recommended, if you include physical activity in a longitudinal analysis, to include or to define your minimal requirement of days as at least 4 days of assessment. And actually, it's at least 4 weekdays of assessment, because we see that if we include the weekend days in the physical activity assessment, the effect size will drop, because including weekend days will again increase the variability of the assessment. Then how should we interpret this physical activity assessment? I've listed here the 3, I think, most commonly used recommendations of physical activity, which is doing at least 150 minutes of MVPA, or at least moderate to vigorous intense physical activity per week. You can use a step count, step-defined cutoffs by Tudor-Lock, as I used in the beginning of my presentation, or you can also use the physical activity level, or the POL, which should be above 1.5 according to the recommendations. But very important is that these recommendations are for the healthy population. But in the most recent physical activity guidelines, there is also a section on physical activity recommendations for patients with chronic disorders. And there it is stated that the physical activity should be as high as possible, including but relating to the patient's ability. And if I then quickly go back to the 2 patients that I included at the beginning of my presentation, you have seen that the lung function of these patients were comparable. But if we look to the exercise capacity of these patients are completely different. So this patient, the left patient, has a rather preserved 6-minute walk test of 520 meters, as compared to this right patient who only had 270 meters on the 6-minute walk test. So we know that for the left patient, it will be easier to be physically active as compared to the right patient. So if you aim for a good physical activity in these two patients, it will be completely different. And in this left patient, we know it will be feasible for him to aim for a physical activity, for example, around 7,500 steps, because we know he can do this and he has a rather preserved exercise capacity, whereas in this right patient, 7,500 steps will probably be too high. Then how do we interpret the change in physical activity? And the way we commonly interpret changes is using the minimal important difference. And for step count, we do have a minimal important difference, which is nowadays in the range between 600 and 1,100 steps per day. And then finally, it's important to consider some important influencing factors when you interpret the physical activity. And I've plotted here one of the very first studies showing the influence of season on physical activity in patients with COPD. So these are patients measured in spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And you do see that without providing any intervention, patients measured in summer are as double as active as compared to patients measured in winter times. So it's always important to include the season of your assessment when interpreting the physical activity result of the patient, or also of the intervention effect that you have as a result of a study. So as a summary, I have summarized here the recommendations for data collection, post-processing, and interpretation, but I will not go again through them, I think. I wanted to end with a final question, but perhaps we, in light of the time, I think it's better maybe to go immediately to the Q&A if you agree.
Thank you very much, Hélène. This was truly an excellent presentation. We have had some questions from the attendees, and one of the first questions that came to you was from Kavila, who wanted to know, how important do you think it is to establish physical activity as a vitality sign of its own, rather than just always trying to associate it or correlate it to other clinical measurements, for example, lung function?
Really important. And I think that's what probably one of the other reasons in my very first MCQ that was answered. For example, or an important vital sign, it can be when patients are experiencing an exacerbation. We do see that patients are decreasing their physical activity the days before an exacerbation. So if you look to physical activity as a vital sign, I think it can provide us a lot of information. And if you see that a patient is, for example, dropping his physical activity, it should be an important red flag for us, knowing that probably there is something going on with that patient. So I completely agree that it should be a vital sign, and it's really important. And we should not only relate it to other things, but it's really an outcome important at its own.
I fully agree with you, Hélène. And we can also see in your presentation, looking at the patient examples, that, for example, the lung function, trying to correlate physical activity to lung function might perhaps not be the best way looking at it. Yeah, another question that came in from Henrik, he wanted to know how many of these presented medical devices are validated when it comes to sleep assessment, for example, sleep quality. Do you have any input on that?
Well, you started in your introduction with saying that I sleep with physical activity, but I'm completely not an expert in sleep. So actually, it's hard for me to answer on this. I do think that the Actigraph has been validated for sleep, but honestly, I don't know. My expertise is on physical activity, and we always do the waking hour assessments. So we probably ignore a bit also an important parameter, because more and more research is also about the 24-hour composition throughout the day. But I'm afraid I cannot answer this.
But thank you, Hélène. Another question from Martin is saying that we're talking about physical activity, and of course we're focusing on steps and we're focusing on walking, but is anything known about other activities other than walking when it comes to physical activity in respiratory diseases?
Yeah, I don't know whether the question is about other activities or maybe other outcomes.
how I interpret the question is more than, is there other activities other than walking that we should focus on when we're talking about physical activity, like riding a bike or?
Yeah. Well, I think that we know that walking is probably the most important or the most mostly done activity by our patients. And actually, this was also work as part of the Proactive project, where patients were really interviewed about the importance of physical activity and what physical activity is from a patient experience. And it seems for us that walking is what patients are typically doing, but also steps is an outcome measure that patients can understand. So therefore, it's also easy to have this as an outcome measure to talk to patients because they understand what a step is. Of course, riding a bike, and I think Martijn is from the Netherlands, so there people are cycling a lot. But if we look to, for example, even patients in Belgium, we don't see a lot of patients that are cycling. So therefore, I think it's valid to only focus on walking time. But of course, if we do any research, we always also look to time in activity, and also time in MVPA, for example, that also includes those measurements. I think the most important activity for probably is that we are missing is, for example, swimming, but I don't think a lot of our patients are swimming. So this is something we cannot measure with our activity monitors nowadays.
So the take-home message is still that, okay, we can focus on walking, but it could be that other activities might also be important, but then we can look at other outcomes rather than steps, of course. And a related question to that, Helene, is from Bea Valero, and she wanted to know when using this type of medical devices, what would you recommend or prefer to look at other than steps? Should we look at walking time, light intensity physical activity, sedentary time?
What I would recommend is always, actually, first of all, steps per day. But perhaps what is also an advantage of steps per day is that it's rather device agnostic. So we can compare data across devices. They all measure this. Whereas, for example, time in at least moderate intense activity, those cutoffs that are used for MVPA are different between the devices, so it's more difficult to make a comparison between the devices. But so I would always also look at time in MVPA, but also very important is time in at least light intense activity, because we know that MVPA is an outcome that is very hard to change in our patients. They don't do a lot of MVPA. So all our interventions, it's really hard to increase MVPA, and therefore we know that time in at least light intense activity is a much more sensitive outcome. It's an outcome that we can change. So I would always also look at that as an outcome.
Okay, thank you, Helene. The questions are running in here, and another from Germano Ferreira is talking about the cutoff that normally we're talking about 8 to 10,000 steps per day. It's very difficult for many people to reach that, and specifically for patients with respiratory diseases. Do you have any information? Is this a evidence-based cutoff, or how should we look at reaching this target in our patient populations?
Well, I think the most important take-home message on this question would be never try to ask a patient or recommend a patient to do 10,000 steps, because for most of our patients, this will be just too high and it will provide them with negative feedback. So always try to go in little steps, I must say. But when you look to steps per day, there is a dose-response relationship, for example, with mortality. And this is not different from the healthy population, where we see that the more you do, the better, actually. And this is the same in our patients. So actually, I would say every step counts, and the more, the better. But if your patient is only doing 2,500 steps and he has only a 6-minute walk test of, let's say, 250 meters, like the case that I have shown you, then it will never be possible to ask that patient to do 10,000 steps. So go in small steps and know, and this is also something we should say to the patient, is that the more the better, but really every step counts. So going from a very low inactive lifestyle to maybe somewhat active lifestyle is really or will make a huge difference for that patient.
Yeah, and I think when we talk with patients, for example, here in Sweden, we look at the MCID for physical activity, and that is around 600 steps. And when we have done some calculation, that's about doing a 7 minute walk.
Mm.
And if you tell a patient, okay, can you do an extra 6 to 7 minute walk a day, then it's more feasible to reach that goal compared to doing a 10,000 steps.
Yep, I think that's very good adding information. Yep.
Another question from Rainer Glöckel, and he would like to thank you for your excellent talk. And he wants to know, how do you explain to a patient what a moderate physical activity means?
That's a difficult one, because actually in our interventions we never aim to increase moderate intense physical activity, so it's not something I would really try to explain to my patient. I would rather go for, as I said, every step counts, and the more you do, the better. But how I explain it to students is going for a walk and getting a bit short of breath and start sweating a bit. But of course, getting a little bit short of breath in our patients, well, that's not the definition of moderate intense activity. So that's not something you can really use in your patients. But as I said, I would always focus on increasing the number of steps per day and not really focus on moderate intense activities.
Okay. Another question from Fabio Pitta. He would like to thank you for a great overview, and he has a question on sedentary behavior. He wants to know, what's the state of art on all this information concerning variables of sedentary behavior and not variables focusing on physical activity? Mm-hmm. For example, time spent sitting or time below 1.5 METs.
That's also a very good question. And I think nowadays we don't know. There is some research in the healthy population that shows that sedentary behavior even has a larger variability as compared to physical activity, and that you probably need more days of assessment to have a reliable outcome measure. But especially for patients with respiratory disorders, I don't think we know today. So I would use the same recommendations or even more days, because it will provide us with an even more or with a higher variability in the outcome measure. But I think, Fabio, it's a good idea to do that research.
And Chris Bertin has an add-on question or related to that, also talking about sedentary time. Is this something that we should look at as an outcome or as an assessment in our patients?
Well, we know from the healthy population, and also the group of Fabio showed that this is also the same in COPD patients, so that sedentary behavior has an independent relation with, for example, mortality on top of physical activity. So I do think it's an important outcome to look at. But what we also know from literature in the healthy population also is that it's hard to change two behaviors at the same time. So it's always better to first try to change one behavior and then probably the other. So I think not focus on changing both behaviors at the same time. But actually in patients with COPD, we know that there is quite a strong relationship between physical activity and sedentary behavior. So probably if you increase your physical activity, then your sedentary behavior will decrease automatically. So I would perhaps as a clinical recommendation say that in the better patients try to increase physical activity. But for example, in the case that I showed you with no variability in physical activity, very low exercise capacity, this was also a patient with a lot of symptoms of dyspnea, then maybe it's better to focus on decreasing the sedentary behavior instead of trying to increase the physical activity.
And we're running out of time, and we have a lot of questions left. And hopefully, Hélène, you can be able to, we can respond in any other way to the participants. But I would like to end with a question that are not related to objective measurements of physical activity. And it's a question that how is it related to the questionnaires? Because it could be financial reasons that we can't measure physical activity, objectively, can we use a questionnaire to look at physical activity? And if so, if this is our only possibility, can we do something to perhaps have a more reliable measurement over time?
I think it will always be very difficult because we know that questionnaires are not sensitive. They come with a recall bias. They also come with a bias because patients know that we want them to be active. So there is social desirability. So for me, actually, I would never recommend to use a questionnaire. Of course, if that's the only option you have, then it will provide you a very first insight in your patient. And we also know that if you screen with a questionnaire and the patient is very inactive, then we know that he will be very inactive. So you're quite sure. But if your questionnaire says that the patient will perhaps be, or his physical activity will be okay, then actually I don't think we can trust whether the physical activity is really okay or whether there is a bias in the assessment. So I think I have to disappoint you with this answer, but I would never recommend to use a questionnaire, except if you have really an epidemiological study with a lot of patients where you aim to classify your patients, then you can do this. But for an individual assessment, I would never recommend this.
And I think we need to end there. And I would like to thank you, Hélène, for, again, an excellent presentation. And I hope everyone that have attended, we have been close to 170 attendees during this webinar, are also as happy as I am with your presentation and your answers to the questions. And just to the participants, this was the first webinar arranged by the physiotherapy group within the ERS. And we will, after summer, have the opportunity to do this more frequently. And we are very much looking forward to your input, both when it comes to different topics and suggestions for speakers. So you can contact either me or Chris Bertin, the chair of the group, with your suggestions. And again, thank you very much, Hélène, for an excellent presentation. And I wish you all a good evening.
Thank you, André.